I was born and raised in a small town in Alabama where folks knew each other's names and where trust was the glue that kept neighbors close like family. My life was plain but steady, and for many years I thought it was blessed. I married young to a man I loved with all my heart, and together we built a home that stood proud even though it wasn't grand. Our house had a porch swing that creaked in the summer heat, and every evening I would sit there with a glass of sweet tea while he came home from work, tired but smiling, because he knew I had supper waiting. That was the rhythm of my life, a rhythm I thought would never change. When I married him, I believed in forever. We took vows in front of God and our families, and I trusted those words more than anything else. For years, we worked hard together. I cooked, cleaned, raised the children, tended the little garden out back, and he worked his long shifts, bringing home the money we needed. There was nothing fancy about our life, but we had each other, and that was enough for me, or so I thought. Next door lived my neighbor, a woman who had moved into town not too many years after we married. At first, she was nothing more than a friendly face across the fence, someone I waved to when I hung the laundry or when I took my kids outside to play. She was the type who liked to dress nice even when she had nowhere to go. Her hair was always done, her lipstick always shining, and she carried herself in a way that made heads turn. I didn't think much of it because I never imagined she would ever be more than a neighbor. I tried to be kind to her, offering pies, lending sugar, stopping for short talks. She seemed sweet enough, and in a small town like ours, being neighborly was just what you did. For a long while, I noticed nothing unusual. My husband and I went on with life as always. But slowly, little things began to change, and though I saw them, I brushed them aside, telling myself it was just my imagination. My husband started spending a little more time outdoors, mowing the lawn longer than necessary, fixing things that didn't really need fixing. Sometimes I would glance out and see my neighbor leaning on the fence, talking to him, laughing in that way women laugh when they want attention. I told myself it was harmless, just friendly chatter, because I trusted him more than anything in the world. But in the back of my mind, a tiny seed of doubt started to grow. I remember one evening, so clearly, I had made his favorite fried chicken, and I was waiting on the porch for him to come home. The sun was setting, and the cicadas were singing, but he was late. When he finally walked in, he smelled faintly of perfume, not mine, not any I owned. I asked where he had been, and he said he stopped by to help the neighbor fix a loose screen door. I wanted to believe him, so I did. But that night, as I lay in bed beside him, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling inside me. In a town like ours, gossip spreads faster than wildfire, but nobody ever whispered a word to me. Maybe they didn't know, or maybe they pitied me enough to stay silent. Still, I began noticing how she smiled at him, how her eyes followed him when he walked past. She started borrowing things from me more often. Little things like flour or milk, though I suspected she only wanted an excuse to knock on my door and see him. And he didn't seem to mind. The more I tried to hold on to my marriage, the more it slipped away, though at that time I was still too blind to accept it. Looking back now, I realize that love can make you see only what you want to see. You close your eyes to the cracks forming, thinking that if you ignore them long enough, they will disappear. But cracks only grow, and eventually they break the whole thing apart. That was the beginning of the unraveling, though I didn't yet know just how far it would go. At night, I prayed to God to bless our home and protect our marriage, never imagining that the very person I share my trust with every day, my own neighbor, would be the one to tear it all apart. As time went on, the little things became harder to ignore. My husband was a creature of habit, the kind of man who liked his meals at the same hour, his shirts pressed just so, his boots lined up by the door. But suddenly his pattern shifted. He started working later than usual, or so he said. When I asked about it, he told me overtime had picked up, and I wanted to believe him, because a wife who has spent years building a life with her husband does not want to imagine betrayal. Yet his eyes would not meet mine when he spoke, and his answers grew shorter, almost as if he had no patience for my questions anymore. I would sit on the porch swing waiting, sometimes rocking until the night grew still and quiet, the supper gone cold on the table inside. And when he did come home, he carried excuses instead of smiles. I held on to hope, because hope was all I had. My children were still small, and I wanted them to grow up in a steady house with both their parents side by side. I convinced myself I was only imagining things, that my neighbor's friendliness was harmless and my husband's distance was just tiredness. But the truth was slowly eating me alive, even if I pretended not to see it. One afternoon, I stepped outside with a basket of laundry and I saw him again, leaning against a fence, talking to her. She was laughing, her hand brushing his arm as if she had every right to touch what belonged to me. He didn't pull away. In fact, he leaned closer, like her laughter was the sweetest sound he had ever heard. My heart dropped into my stomach, and I stood there frozen with the laundry clutched against me. Neither of them noticed me right away, and when they finally did, he straightened too quickly, and she flashed me a smile that felt more like a smirk. I walked back inside with my cheeks burning, but I said nothing. I wanted to scream, to confront them both, but fear held my tongue. Fear of losing him. Fear of breaking apart the only life I had ever known. Nights grew colder between us, even though we lay beneath the same quilt. He no longer reached for my hand. He no longer shared the little stories from his day. Instead, silence filled the room, a silence heavy enough to crush me. I prayed harder, asking God to turn his heart back toward me, to shield him from temptation. But each day I felt him slipping further away. Then came the day that stripped away all my denial. It was a Saturday morning, bright and warm, and he told me he was heading into town for errands. Hours passed, and when I realized he was gone too long, I gathered the children and went into town myself. My heart told me something wasn't right, and though I didn't want to believe it, I needed to see with my own eyes. And there they were. I saw them walking out of the diner together, her hand brushing his arm again. And this time, instead of pulling away, he let her hand linger. They laughed together, so comfortable, so familiar, as though they had been living another life behind my back. I stood across the street, the children tugging at my skirt, asking for ice cream, while I felt my whole world crumble into dust. He noticed me then, his face changing in an instant from laughter to guilt. She, however, didn't even flinch. She looked right at me, bold as ever, with eyes that seemed to say, "Yes, I've taken what was yours." My knees nearly gave out beneath me, but I held my children close and turned away, too broken to cause a scene. That night when he returned home, I finally found my voice. I asked him if he loved her. I asked him if he had forgotten the vows he made to me, the promises we built our lives upon. He sat silent at first, unable to speak, and in that silence I found my answer. When he finally spoke, his words were like knives. He said he didn't mean for it to happen, that he never planned it, but he couldn't deny the feelings he had for her. He said she made him feel young again, made him feel alive. I listened, stunned, wondering what I had been doing all these years, keeping the house, raising the children, standing by his side. Was that not enough? Was I no longer enough? My heart broke into pieces that night. I wanted to beg him to choose me, to fight for our marriage. but the look in his eyes told me that his heart was already gone. And worse, it had gone not to a stranger, but to the woman who lived just a few steps from my door. The days that followed were a blur of tears and confusion. Neighbors began whispering, and though nobody dared say it straight to my face, I could feel their pity. In a small Alabama town, everyone knows everyone's business, and my humiliation was no secret. I could not walk to the store or to church without feeling the weight of eyes upon me. My neighbor, shameless as ever, started flaunting it. She wore brighter dresses, walked taller, and let the whole world see what she had taken. And my husband, the man I thought would be mine for life, walked beside her. I don't know which cut deeper, the betrayal itself, or the fact that she lived so close that I could not escape the sight of them together. I had once trusted her with my friendship, and she had used that very trust as a weapon against me. Nights became endless. Filled with sobs, I tried to hide from my children. I didn't want them to see me broken, but they were old enough to know something was wrong. They asked where Daddy was, and I had no words that would make sense to their little hearts. All I could do was hold them close and promise them that no matter what, I would never leave. And deep inside, a strength began to grow, though at the time it was buried under pain. I began to understand that if I was to survive this betrayal, I had to find that strength and cling to it, even if it meant standing alone. The weeks after his confession were the hardest of my life. Each morning I woke up, and for a few seconds, before the memories rushed back, I felt like myself again, the wife of a man who loved me, the mother of children growing in a safe home. But then the truth would wash over me like a cold wave, and I'd remember he was slipping further into the arms of another woman, the very neighbor who smiled at me across the fence not long ago. I had lived my whole life with the belief that if you worked hard, loved your family, and trusted your faith, you'd be safe from such betrayals. But life has a way of teaching you harsh lessons, and this was mine. He grew bolder in his distance. At first he tried to hide it, but once the town began to talk, once the children even started asking questions, he stopped pretending. He would come home late, or sometimes not at all. And when he did, his words to me were short, his eyes always elsewhere. I had never felt so invisible, standing in the same kitchen where I once cooked meals that made him smile, now only hearing the hum of the refrigerator as he sat silent across the table. My neighbor, the woman I once shared coffee with, no longer bothered with small talk. She carried herself like she had won something, like she had the right to take pride in stealing another woman's husband. She walked with a sway, her head high, and when she looked at me, it was not with shame, but with something close to triumph. I could hardly bear to step outside without feeling her shadow, without feeling the knife twist in my chest. My children were confused, and nothing hurt me more than watching their little faces search for answers. One night, my eldest asked me if Daddy loved us anymore. I gathered them into my arms, holding them so tight I could barely breathe, and I whispered over and over that their father loved them, that nothing they had done caused this. But inside, my own heart doubted. I wondered how a man who could walk away from his vows so easily could still love the children who shared his blood. Yet, for their sake, I tried to keep my bitterness hidden. Church became my refuge. On Sundays, I would dress the children in their best clothes, hold my chin high, and walk into that little white building where hymns rose up to the rafters. Some women looked at me with pity, some with curiosity, but I kept my eyes fixed on the cross. When the choir sang, I let the tears fall quietly, asking God to give me strength to keep going, to keep mothering, to keep living, even as my heart lay shattered. The preacher's wife pulled me aside one morning and said, "Child, you cannot control what others do, but you can control how you rise above it." Those words stayed with me, even on the darkest nights. My husband finally admitted he didn't plan to stop seeing her. He said it plain, as if it were nothing, as if the years we shared, the children we created, the home we built together, were just scraps he could sweep aside. I wanted to fight, I wanted to scream, but my voice had grown tired from all the silent battles I fought within myself. So I let him go, not because I didn't love him, but because I realized I could not chain a heart that no longer belonged to me. Letting him go did not feel like freedom, not at first. It felt like death. It felt like burying a part of myself I could never dig up again. Nights were long, filled with loneliness, so heavy I thought it would swallow me whole. But slowly I learned to move through the pain. I began to find small comforts, the laughter of my children when they played in the yard, the warm sun on my back when I hung the laundry, the familiar hymns that carried me through Sundays. I found strength in the little things, because big strength seemed impossible. My neighbor flaunted her new prize, but what she did not know was that a woman who steals another's husband will never know true peace. Deep down, I believed that one day her triumph would turn to dust, and she would face the weight of her choices. But I could not spend my life watching her or him. I had to turn my eyes forward for myself and for my children. There were days I failed at that, days I broke down in the kitchen or cried myself to sleep. But each morning I rose again, because that is what mothers do. We rise no matter how broken, for the sake of those who depend on us. Over time, people in town stopped whispering. They saw me holding strong, walking with dignity, and I realized that sometimes the best revenge is not anger, but survival. My husband may have chosen her, but I chose to keep my soul intact. I chose not to let bitterness eat me alive. And though it took a long time, I began to believe that my story was not over, that maybe God still had chapters ahead where my heart could heal. Time has a way of stretching out when your heart is broken. Days felt like weeks, and weeks felt like months. I tried to carry on as though nothing had happened, but every corner of my home reminded me of what was lost. The chair he used to sit in after supper stood empty. His boots by the door gathered dust. Even the sound of the screen door slamming made me ache, because I remembered the way he used to come home whistling. Now the sound was gone, replaced only by silence. My neighbor and my husband no longer hid what they were doing. She walked beside him at the store. She sat next to him at the diner, and sometimes I even saw them in her yard, laughing together while I stood behind my curtains holding back tears. The cruelty of it was not just that he left me. It was that he left me for someone so close, someone I had once trusted. In a town like ours, there's no escaping your past, and my past was now living right next door. I couldn't even hang laundry without catching sight of her, and sometimes she would look at me boldly, as though daring me to confront her. But I never gave her the satisfaction. I turned my face away and focused on the shirts and sheets in my hands, telling myself I would not stoop to her level. My children were the only reason I managed to keep going. They needed me more than ever. At night, when the youngest cried for Daddy, I held her and whispered soft songs until she drifted back to sleep. I had to learn to carry their pain along with my own, and though it was heavy, it gave me strength. I wanted them to see that even when life breaks you, you can still stand. You can still choose love, even if the person you loved most betrayed you. I began to rely on my faith more deeply. I read my Bible every night, letting the words wash over me like a balm for my wounds. I wrote down verses on scraps of paper and tucked them into my apron pocket, pulling them out whenever the weight grew too heavy. The The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Those words became a lifeline. And yet, even with my faith, the loneliness was fierce. Sometimes I would sit on the porch after putting the children to bed, staring at the stars, asking God why this had happened to me. What had I done to deserve this kind of betrayal? But answers never came. Only silence. Still, in that silence, I found a strange kind of strength. Maybe God wasn't giving me answers because he was giving me endurance instead. My husband's absence left me to handle everything alone. Bills, repairs, raising children, it all fell on my shoulders. At first, I stumbled under the weight. I didn't know how I would make ends meet, but I learned. I started baking pies and selling them at the farmer's market. I cleaned houses for extra money. I found ways to keep food on the table, to keep the lights on, to make sure my children had shoes on their feet. Each small victory reminded me that though he had walked away, I was still standing. And maybe I was stronger than I ever realized. There were times when I saw regret in his eyes. He would come to pick up the children, and for a moment, when he saw me standing in the doorway, something softened in his face. But then she would appear, calling him from across the yard, and he would turn away again. Perhaps he knew what he had lost, but pride kept him from admitting it. Or maybe he truly believed she could give him more than I ever did. Either way, I stopped waiting for him to return. I stopped hoping for a knock on the door, a whispered apology, a promise to make things right. Hope had been the rope that kept me tied to pain, and when I let it go, I found a new kind of freedom. It wasn't easy. It was raw, and it was lonely, but it was real. I started to discover pieces of myself I had forgotten. I learned I loved to paint, something I hadn't done since I was a girl. On evenings when the children were asleep, I would sit at the kitchen table with brushes and colors, losing myself in the strokes. For a little while, my heart would quiet. I began planting more in my garden. Too, watching life push through the soil, reminding me that growth is always possible, even after seasons of loss. People in town began to treat me differently, not as the woman who had been betrayed, but as the woman who endured. They told me they admired my strength, and though I didn't always feel strong, I realized I had become an example for others. My story was messy, it was painful, but it was also proof that even when life takes something precious, you can still stand on your own 2 feet. My neighbor thought she had one, but what she didn't know was that she had set me free. She freed me from a man who could not be true, who could not keep his vows. And though it still hurt, I began to see that maybe losing him was not the end of me. It was the beginning of finding who I truly was. Life carried on, even though inside I sometimes felt like I had been buried alive. The seasons changed as they always did. Summer heat rolled into cool autumn winds, and still my neighbor and my husband paraded their affair like it was something pure. I tried not to look, tried not to listen. But in a small Alabama town, nothing stays hidden and nothing is forgotten. Every time I went to the store or walked through the church doors, I felt eyes on me. Some were filled with pity, some with judgment, and some with quiet admiration. People wondered how I kept walking tall, how I didn't throw stones or cause a scene, but truth was, it took everything in me just to keep breathing each day. My children were growing, and they began to ask harder questions, the kind that twisted my heart in ways nothing else could. Mama, why does Daddy spend more time next door than here? Mama, why doesn't Daddy sit with us at church anymore? I swallowed my pain and gave them the gentlest answers I could, telling them that grown folks make mistakes, but that it had nothing to do with how much Daddy loved them. Inside, I was screaming, but I never let that scream touch their ears. I had already lost my husband, I refused to let them lose their childhood, too. I leaned harder on my faith because it was the only place that didn't turn its back on me. I would sit by the window late at night with my Bible open on my lap, the lamp casting a warm glow, and I'd read the same passages over and over until the words sank into my bones. Forgiveness, faith, endurance. I didn't know if I could forgive, not then, but I knew I had to endure. Some nights I wept until my pillow was wet, asking God why my love wasn't enough, why my kindness had been trampled, why betrayal had come to my very doorstep. And though I never got an answer in words, I felt a strength grow in me, little by little, like the steady growth of a tree whose roots dig deep into the soil. Work became my escape. I took in sewing from women at church. I baked pies and biscuits to sell. I even started babysitting for neighbors. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep my children clothed and fed, enough to remind me that I could make it without him. Each dollar earned was a reminder that I wasn't helpless, and as I worked, I found pieces of myself I had forgotten. The part of me that was resourceful, the part that was creative, the part that could survive even in the harshest storm. My husband, meanwhile, seemed to change. The man I had once known, steady and dependable, now carried himself differently. He laughed louder, talked smoother, dressed sharper. It was as if he had put on a mask of youth, chasing a feeling that would never last. Sometimes I wondered if deep down he regretted leaving me. But pride can be a heavy chain. He had made his choice, and he was too stubborn to admit it might have been wrong. My neighbor, oh, she wore her victory like a crown. She walked through town with her head held high, her hand tucked into his arm as though she had earned him. But I knew what she had taken wasn't hers to begin with, and what begins in betrayal never grows into peace. I told myself that though they might smile now, their smiles would one day fade, because a relationship built on broken vows will never stand steady. My children gave me purpose when I felt I had none. Their laughter in the yard, their little arms around my neck, their sleepy voices calling me Mama in the dark of night, those were the things that reminded me I was still alive, still needed, still loved. No man, not even the one who betrayed me, could take that from me. One evening, my eldest came to me with a drawing she had made in school. It was of our family, all of us together. I saw myself, her siblings, and even her daddy standing there. But she had drawn a big fence between us and him, and on his side of the fence was another figure, our neighbor. My heart broke, but I realized children see more than we think. They knew the truth, even if I tried to shield them from it. That night, I promised myself again that I would never let their father's choices define their worth. They would grow up knowing love because I would give it to them tenfold. Over time, I learned to stop looking out the window toward the house next door. I stopped counting the hours he spent away. I stopped measuring myself against the woman who had taken him. I began, little by little, to focus only on what I could control. My children, my home, my heart. It wasn't easy. Some days I fell apart all over again, but each time I picked myself up, I felt a little stronger. People began to notice. Women at church told me I inspired them. Men at the market nodded respectfully when I walked by. I had become, without meaning to, a symbol of resilience. And though my heart was still scarred, I realized that scars are not signs of weakness. They are proof you survived. I didn't know what the future held, but I began to trust that I would be all right. My husband might have chosen her, but I still had my children, my faith, and my strength. And maybe, just maybe, one day I would look back on all of it and see not just betrayal, but the path that led me to discover who I really was. As the years passed, I learned to live with the ache, the way some folks learn to live with an old wound that never quite heals. It didn't disappear, but it stopped bleeding. I raised my children with as much love as I could pour into them, and they became my reason for every step I took. They grew taller, stronger, and kinder, and each time I saw them smile, I felt that maybe I had done something right, even if my marriage had fallen apart. My husband's new life with my neighbor unfolded right before my eyes. They worked in their yard together. They drove to church side by side. They sat at the very diner where he and I once shared milkshakes. At first, I couldn't look without feeling like a knife was twisting inside me, but after a while, the knife dulled. I began to see them not with anger, but with a kind of pity. For all their smiles and laughter, there was always something hollow about it, like they were both pretending to be happy because they had to prove their choices were worth it. And maybe that's the cruelest part of betrayal, that sometimes the people who betray you don't end up happier at all. I began to notice little cracks in their perfect picture. My husband, once steady and proud, started looking weary. He no longer whistled when he walked, his shoulders slumped, and though he laughed in public, I could see his eyes growing tired. My neighbor, who once flaunted her beauty like a prize, began to look restless. She had what she thought she wanted, but still she seemed unsatisfied. I realized then that stolen love never brings peace. It may burn bright at first, but flames fed by lies always turn to ashes. Meanwhile, I was building something stronger. My life, though harder than before, was rooted in truth. I didn't have wealth, I didn't have a partner by my side, but I had honesty, I had faith, and I had the deep love of my children. And those things cannot be stolen. One day, years later, I was in town running errands when I saw him alone. He looked older, worn down, as if life had weighed heavy on him. He caught sight of me, and for a moment, his face softened, almost like he wanted to speak. But then the moment passed, and he lowered his eyes. I walked on, my head held high, and in that instant I realized something powerful. I no longer needed his words. I no longer needed his apology or his regret. I had already set myself free. My children continued to grow, and they became my pride. They worked hard in school, they respected others, and they carried themselves with kindness. I told them often that no matter what had happened between their father and me, they were never at fault, and they should never doubt their worth. In fact, I told them their worth was greater because they had endured something hard and still chosen love. And slowly, I began to believe those words for myself, too. Life was not easy. There were bills that stretched me thin, nights when loneliness pressed in, mornings when I felt too tired to rise. But each day I rose anyway. I rose because survival is its own kind of victory. And as I grew older, I began to see that my story was not just about betrayal, it was about strength. My neighbor could steal my husband, but she could never steal my dignity, my faith, or my future. That belonged to me, and me alone. In time, I even began to forgive, not because they deserved it, but because I refused to let bitterness poison my soul. Forgiveness was not forgetting. I would never forget the pain, the humiliation, the tears. But forgiveness was setting down the heavy stone I had been carrying for so long. And when I did, I felt lighter. My children noticed, too. They saw a mother who had been hurt, but who still chose love, who still stood tall, who still found joy in small things like a blooming flower or a song on Sunday morning. And I knew then that my story was not one of loss, but one of survival. Years later, as I sit here telling you this story, I understand that sometimes the very thing that breaks you is the thing that shapes you into who you were meant to be. My neighbor thought she had won by stealing my husband, but what she really did was free me. Free me to discover my own strength. Free me to build a life of honesty. Free me to raise children who knew the true meaning of resilience. And though the pain will always be a part of my past, it no longer controls my future. I may have lost a husband, but I found myself, and that in the end was the greater gift. Looking back now, after all these years, I can finally see the story for what it truly was, not just a tale of betrayal, but a lesson about strength, faith, and the surprising ways life can heal you when you think you are beyond repair. For a long time, I thought my life had ended the moment my husband chose to walk away, but now I know that was only the ending of one chapter, not the whole book. What I thought would destroy me instead reshaped me. It taught me to dig deeper into myself, to find courage I never thought I had, and to stand on my own 2 feet without leaning on someone else to hold me up. In those first painful months, I couldn't imagine a future where I would feel whole again. But slowly, piece by piece, I rebuilt myself. I found joy in simple things, the laughter of my children around the supper table, the peace of sitting in my garden with the morning sun warming my face, the comfort of hymns filling the church on Sunday mornings. Those small joys became the foundation of a new life. My children grew into fine adults, each one carrying the lessons of resilience they had seen in me. They knew what it meant to endure hardship, to keep walking even when the road was rough. And though they carried the pain of their father's choices, they also carried the strength of their mother's survival. They became my greatest pride, the proof that love, when tended faithfully, will always bear fruit. And my neighbor, the woman who thought she had won, she did not win at all. Over time, I watched her smile fade, her pride slip, her restlessness grow. A love that begins in betrayal cannot last, because trust is the soil in which love grows, and there's had none. I will not lie and say I felt no satisfaction when I saw the cracks appear, when I heard whispers of arguments and disappointments. But more than satisfaction, I felt freedom, because I realized their choices no longer defined me. I was no longer the woman left behind. I was the woman who endured, who rose, who lived. One day, many years later, my husband came to see me. His hair was gray, his shoulders stooped, and his eyes carried a heaviness I had not seen before. He stood on my porch, the same porch where I once waited with sweet tea in my hands, and he looked at me with a sorrow that words could not hide. He told me he was sorry. He told me he had been foolish, chasing something that never lasted, and that he had lost the best thing he ever had. I listened quietly, and for a moment I felt the old wound stir. But then I realized something. I no longer needed his apology. I no longer needed his love, his presence, or his regret. I had already made peace with the past. I told him I forgave him, not for his sake, but for mine, because forgiveness had set me free long ago. He left that day with tears in his eyes, and I closed the door with a calmness I had never felt before. I was not the same woman he had betrayed. I was stronger, wiser, and whole. And my neighbor, she had grown old too, carrying the weight of choices that never brought her true happiness. The victory she once wore so proudly had turned hollow, and though I felt no joy in her sorrow, I felt no anger either. I had let both of them go long before. My story, in the end, is not about what they did to me. It is about what I became despite them. I became a woman who learned that strength is born in struggle, that dignity can be kept even when everything else is taken, and that love, true love, is not about possession but about endurance, honesty, and faith. I may not have had the marriage I dreamed of, but I built a life filled with real love, the kind that could not be stolen. And if you are listening to me now, wondering how you will survive your own heartbreak, let my story remind you that you can. Betrayal may feel like the end, but it is not the end of you. It is only the breaking of what was false, so that something true can rise in its place. I thought I lost everything when my neighbor stole my husband, but I see now I did not lose it all. I gained strength, I gained wisdom, I gained the unshakable knowledge that I am enough. And in the quiet of my garden, with the sun warming my face and the laughter of my children echoing in my memory, I know I have lived a life that was full, honest, and strong. My neighbor may have stolen my husband, but she never stole me. And that, in the end, is why I can tell this story with peace in my heart